Yeah, like, well, I know right where they stay, but no, we haven't had. Well, they're not up on the top. They're not in where you're talking about. No, they come down to what we call the Glacier Lake area. In fact, there was like six there yesterday. This is
As always, public is welcome, but just to keep us on track, let's do some public comment at the end. 3 minutes plus. If any board member has questions, they can follow up with us.
Thank you, Mayor and Board. We're going to the Chapter 14 code updates we've been working on for a while, just been delayed in this workshop due to other priorities. But tonight we have Greg Steed from Merrick here to assist with this. And we'll also have Brad Rome, who helped work on this. So I will kick it over to Greg to kind of talk through these bullet points. I do have the code if we want to bring that up to see the section. Change that, the red line. Last time we went through line by line, and that was tedious. So it kind of give you the bullet points. I know that the board was given this list last week to kind of get a heads up on what we were looking at. So at this time, I'll let Greg kick it off and start going through here.
Hi, good afternoon, Steve. I'm a civil engineer, been working with and for the town for 2.5 years now. Thank you for your time. To give you a little bit of background, when we were looking at the Byers water main replacement project and the big sewer main replacement last season. And we're dialing in our design and getting close to 100% on the design set, getting town staff feedback. There were a lot of things that came up, like, we don't really like that detail. We've had failures with that. We like this other method of doing things. Or we'd be going through the code and realize, well, it references a specific item that is no longer in production. So at that point, we decided, all right, as a team, everybody, as you're seeing things in the code and in the details that that are outdated, let's start refining, and then we'll get together in the office and we'll make a concerted effort to go through the code and try and bring it up to current standards. So going through these bullet points, we've tried to highlight how we approached the major points that we tried to address with the code revisions. The last revision, of course, dated in the code is 2015. I'm not sure that any of the current staff was around then, so I can't say what actually got revised at that point. But we worked quite a bit through this past off season, going through every detail, adding a number of details like a standard bollard. We decided not to try and add a good number of details, 45 details. But we updated the code references that were, say the International Plumbing Code for 2012. Well, we knocked off all those dates and said the most recent issuance of that code, instead of trying to detail exactly what year a reference standard was going to be listed in the code. Lessons learned revisions. Again, there were things that the field staff on the town's behalf called out to me and are in red lines and said, this isn't working for us. Let's make some edits. Some of the verbiage and language in the code was not necessarily clear. We ran into instances. One particular consideration in the water and sewer world is when you cross those two kinds of pipes. That's an area where you want to pay particular attention about making sure that you don't have the risk of sewage getting anywhere near your potable water line. So there's a lot of precautions that you take to separate those lines when you cross them. Well, the code detail was, we were having trouble interpreting what to do in the field based on the detail. And it referenced some clamps and some seals on the joints that were no longer in production. So that was one that really stood out, that we spent quite a bit of time looking at. There were a lot of references to, turn in as-built 6 copies on Mylar. That's an outdated form of transferring documentation. So we changed verbiage to electronic documentation is acceptable. There was additional requirements that the state statutes have passed since 2015. One of the big ones is tracer wire. Back in 2016 or 17, there was an explosion near a gas well that was like under a house. Nobody knew the gas line was there. And the state legislature took up a new statute to require tracer wire on all the underground pipes, so that you didn't have these abandoned lines that nobody knew about. The intent being, we can trace everything underground and know where it's at. Well, our code didn't have any references to tracer wire, so we added some of that language.
Greg, how's that work?
So you lay a wire on the pipe, and
What kind of wire?
just like a 12 gauge copper wire.
Okay.
It's rated for underground burial and everything. And then at the ends, you'd bring it up in a valve box for a valve key, or behind a fire hydrant at a test station. And so when a tracing company comes out, they open the little box, they hook up a voltage on the wire, they put a ground in the ground next to it and send a voltage through that wire. And then he can use a sonde, an instrument from the surface, and he can find out where the electromagnetic field is coming out of the wire and trace a water line. Sewer lines are pretty easy to find because you can just drop in a manhole and kind of look down them to the next manhole. But the statute still requires that we trace those lines too.
How about gas lines?
Gas lines have, for the longest time, been either steel and traceable with electricity, or they have always been one of those lines that you want to put the tracer on. The house explosion example was a oil and gas well. I don't think they operated as the same as like an XL residential gas service, but the gas services, in my experience, they're always traceable. At your gas meter, there should be a little wire coming out of the ground next to your meter, and they would use that to trace the line through your yard to the street. We also updated the verbiage on the testing requirements and, giving town staff 48 hours notice before calling in a test, making sure that the test procedures are appropriate for what you're doing. We had a couple of sewer crossings at the railroad 2 summers ago, and our testing standards didn't really address the pressure you would want to test the sewer pipe on if it's below 8 or 10 feet of groundwater. You really don't have to put a lot of pressure on a sewer main to check that it's watertight, because it's flowing only half full all the time. It's not a pressurized pipe. So testing it at a low pressure is your normal, but water above that pipe applies pressure to the sewer main. So if you only put a little bit of pressure on the sewer main and you got all this groundwater above it, you're not really testing anything. So there's other methods you can use to address how to test in that situation. So when we ran into that, it was like, well, we should probably update our testing procedures so that we are able to, approach this kind of test when we need to. Most all of the detail changes and the tracer wire verbiage, we researched Denver Water extensively and what their standards show. We researched other mountain communities, Silverthorne, up and down Front Range, Greeley, Loveland, Fort Collins, all, these towns that we wanted to have a good sampling of what other communities are doing, but also utilize the staffing and expertise of those bigger municipalities so that they can inform our code. So that helped us land on consensus for what we wanted to apply to the Fraser code. We updated 17 of the 44 standard details and added 1 new detail. We updated the seed mix, the restoration seed mix, when we were on buyers looking at hydro seeding the disturbed areas. We got a submittal on the seed mix and we showed it to Kathleen, and she said, well, I don't like this seed mix at all. And it's like, well, that's what's in the code. And so we realized, well, we should probably update the seed mix if the gardener doesn't even agree with what's in the code for it. So we ran into those kind of back and forth through the last 2 years on a number of items, and started making those red lines with Monica when she was here. We didn't get so far with Monica, but we had enough that at the time, I think it was brought up, but then it was tabled again. This past winter, we had a lot more time to really dig into and get granular with the edits. So I think this version is much more thorough of a revision than was prepared a year and a half ago. One of the items, we increased the warranty period to 24 months. That was something that we felt was important. It's a lot more common in the industry now to see the 2-year warranties rather than 1 year. So that was a change that we felt was appropriate. we took the code and put it in a Word file, and we put it on a shared system and tracked changes and put in comments, and we kept a history of all that so that we knew, you know, the questions were getting answered, the edits, you know, where we were editing things. We did the same thing with the code, with the detail edits. We have a PDF with all the red lines and the iterations of how those different details were revised, in some cases multiple times, to get to a final version. I think that, you know, moving forward, we'll continue to find things that we say, you know what, we should put, you know, make a note that that's something that in the future we would want to change again. So, you know, this is a working document, right? It's going to change over time. And I think we are in a good place now to realize that we're going to look at the code as a working document and something that needs to help us do our jobs better, and continue to look at things that need updates.
And I will add that the 2-year warranty is just consistent with what we did last year in chapter 19 in switching to a development improvement agreement that already has a 24-month warranty period. So this is just being consistent in chapter 14 with the same requirements we have if you're putting in a development improvement agreement, which replaced the subdivision improvement agreement and the construction guarantee agreement. Those had 1-year warranties. What we changed last year already put it to a 2-year. So this is just making the warranty period in chapter 14 match the agreements that we would enter into with development. But an example, so on the fire hydrant, for example, we went through, I think, 3 revisions on that detail to here's some things that we have, and it was a constant process. I can share some of those as well. Stop this one. So for example, this is kind of where we started with. That's what our detail had. And sometimes there was confusion in what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. So for example, tie rods and thrust blocks are not necessary with restraint joint fitting. So if we're going with mega lugs, we weren't being consistent. If you're using a mega lug, you still need restrained joints. So cleaning these up to make it clear and consistent. And then we settled on a final detail that will, you know, be presented hopefully next month as an ordinance to change chapter 14. Be able to see all the red lines of what was there, what was changed prior to it going into effect. My intention is to make this, you know, to give time to bring the ordinance forward and have it into effect January 1, and then in March schedule a workshop with all developers in the valley to go over and highlight the changes that are going to affect them, so that everybody knows what's happening. He had mentioned a parking detail. So we had parking. We didn't really have parking that allowed for parallel or angled parking that called out minimum sizes. Our code was not consistent with Winter Park. So parking could be different as you cross a boundary line that's invisible. All of a sudden your parking spaces are either narrower, shorter, much wider. So trying to be consistent through this continuation of Highway 40 and through the 2 municipalities to make sure that we're sizing our parking spaces appropriately. We didn't really make anything smaller. We just allowed for 90-degree and parallel, and then at the different angles, what those sizes and lengths would look like. So trying to make things easier, make our details clear. I know we found a couple details that were actually contradictory within the detail. Tell you to do one thing on one side of the page and something else on another side of the page. So cleaning all of that up, going through and spending a lot of time. I know we had initially tried to do this with the chapter 19, but it wasn't fully fleshed out. And as Greg mentioned, we found a lot of extra stuff to change and make sure that we were trying to be consistent. And one of the biggest things is all of our links that we're telling you to go to somewhere were all broken and dead and no longer worked. So just trying to update all of these things. And as Greg mentioned, not tying something to a specific year of code. As Garrett had us do, we had to update to the latest International Building Code. So changing the language to be to the, you know, that it has to be the most recent adopted version of the code for the town. So we're on a certain cycle with Winter Park that we're adopting code. So as that code is adopted as the building code, we don't have to go back and change language in chapter 14 to strike 2012 to become 2018 or 2021 in this case. So just leave it to that code that's in effect at that time. So trying to make it simpler to follow and easier for us to stay on top of changing. And as you can see, it's been 9 years. There's been a lot of change in the industry. And Greg mentioned that this is going to be a living document. So if tomorrow a developer or an engineer comes with something that isn't necessarily something that the code allows, but we can evaluate it and determine that it's a like standard or a higher standard, we can bring that in and then change the code accordingly at that point. So if there's questions, I can go to specific sections of the code. I have that up and can show the red lines if there's specific questions for certain areas.
Paul, for the parking that you just had up there,
Yeah. Oh, bring it back.
where would we allow compact car parking?
So the only place I could see subcompact car parking would be somewhere like a Murdoch's or a Safeway, a large parking lot, maybe even the Victoria Village parking lots. You could maybe fit 2 more spaces if you're going to go subcompact. It wouldn't be, if you only have 12 spaces, providing for subcompact limits you, but something that has 100 spaces, if you put 5 subcompact in there, maybe you get 2 more spaces out of it. I mean, there are plenty of I feel like we have the really, really large vehicles, then we have some subcompacts, and then you got a couple in the middle.
Compact.
But I mean, I drive with a lot of subcompacts back and forth from Kremlin, but I also drive with dualies, 4-door dualies all day too. So,
But the code requirement for new development is the 10 by 20 spaces, is the number of parking spaces. So they still have to provide for that space, but if they want to take some of those spaces and make them into compact parking, they essentially would exceed the requirements by having compact parking for a section of their parking lot.
yeah, they could end up with more spaces.
Okay.
And again, this is going to tie into the planned chapter 19 revisions that Garrett has coming up probably next summer after he spends the winter being able to look at it. Just try to clean that up as well so that there's not contradictions. That was one of our biggest intents, was trying to make sure that chapter 13, 14, and 19 were all saying the same thing. Okay. So chapter 13 is next. Great.
Is the C-mix, whether we avail, or is that something like a provide or sell, or is that?
The second iteration that they came with, Kathleen was okay with. It was just getting a more local.
It's readily functionally available.
It was pretty available on buyers, was it not?
Yeah, I know that they were buying it from Granite Seed in Denver, which is one of the biggest distributors. I don't know that you could go to Ace and pick it up. I'm not sure. I know that the contractors are bringing it in from Denver.
Yeah.
Are we changing the size of the parking spaces here? Okay, are they smaller? Normally? Within COVID, change the size?
I will check with Garrett on the parking sizes, chapter 19, to make sure they're consistent. What was that?
Mostly on Main, they were small.
And
10 by 20.
Hey everyone, Garrett Scott, sorry I was listening upstairs. So currently our code actually does not allow that compact size shown on the detail, the 8.5 by 17. We do allow 9 by 18 is currently considered our compact space. But again, this standard comes from the town of Winter Park. And currently we allow up to 20% of the required parking spaces to be that 9 by 18 size, the subsurface parking or underground parking, as it's noted on this detail. We could certainly amend chapter 19 to change the compact parking size to be 8.5 by 17, or recognize, a different ratio in the size of compact parking. I think, in the period between this being adopted and further updates to chapter 19, what we would consider is any request for parking spaces that are 8.5 by 17 to be considered a variance from the parking requirements. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So again, I would say that the 10 by 20 and the 9 by 18 are consistent with chapter 19 as it's currently written, but we would look probably to implement some sort of provision where that smaller parking space size could be allowed in limited circumstances. So again, I guess referencing what our code currently says, we allow for large parking lots. I think anything more than 10 spaces. A developer or, property owner could propose that 20% of those total spaces be the compact size. So that could just be as simple as saying the 20% of those spaces could be as small as 8.5 by 17, or maybe we change that ratio to where only 10% of the spaces can be as small as that, and the other 10% can be the 9 by 18, or some other, scenario. Does that make sense?
One thing that I think could use that is there's actually a lot of interest right now because the Colorado Energy Office has been really beefing up the grants available for EV charging stations. And a lot of EV cars are those smaller cars. Could be something that could go in proximity to a charging station in a parking lot or something like that.
Will be required, will it be?
Wiring, right? And
It's just the wiring, having the, yeah, he'll get into that.
We'll discuss
Discuss
that,
that.
yeah, later this evening. Were there any other parking specific questions? Okay.
Any other questions for Paul or Greg?
yeah, before there's an ordinance.
Okay,
Well, good work,
yeah.
gentlemen. That's a lot
Thanks,
of,
guys.
Feel like
that's a lot of work. Thank you.
tried to be better prepared for it this time than we were when I
Mhm.
first got here.
All right. Anything else workshop wise?
I don't think so, unless there's questions. Let me go back to the bullet points real quick. So the one about the water and sewer manhole leakage testing procedures, similar to what we did in chapter 19, trying to cut out some of the middleman work that's been going on where there's just been the town orders something and the developer orders something. And then there being a middleman in this pass through, trying to get rid of that additional step of going from one to another to a third party, trying to clean up some of that to make things easier for everybody. And then again, just references throughout the code, the verbiage was inconsistent, and then trying to make our standard details easier for developers to use and know what we expect, so that they're not using a detail and we're expecting something else when we go in the field. So trying to clean that up and make it easier for us all to work together.
Great. Anyone from the public want to address?
Hi, Clark Lipscomb for the record. Paul, when might we be able to see a red line?
It'll be posted in the packet probably for the second meeting in October.
Okay, but is it going to be posted with an ordinance for them to approve it?
Yeah.
Okay, is there any way that we can get it in advance? I mean, I personally, I think some of these things sound good. I probably have prompted some of them or dealt with some of the issues. And I remember the railroad bore and the different testing parameters that Merritt kept coming up with. That was awful. And the contractors are like, I think they tested 3 different ways. I mean, it was like we were kind of, I don't know, aiming at a moving goalpost. So we need a stable goalpost. But I think more importantly, I didn't hear any involvement of any of the development or contracting community, what I hear is the town's engineers and the town staff have talked about this. And like, I have no idea what seed mix you pick, but I have pallets of seed mix that we use. And I'd like to double check and make sure that, okay, one, can I get it from our seed supplier? Cause I mean, what we've used generally works pretty good. It typically takes about 2 years for it really to get established up here. But I mean, just simple things like that, I think involving people that have actual real experience, actual building, physically doing some of this stuff. As opposed to, no offense to the engineers, the guys that draw it on paper. It's great to make pretty drawings on paper. But, some of it is, practically challenging to implement in the field. And I heard a lot of towns mentioned, that were all front range towns and, digging on the front range, piece of cake. Man, it's
So
pretty
none
much
of this
staying in
involves
clay.
digging. This involves joints and restraints and cleaning up language. Let's not forget that the railroad bore had settling problems. It wasn't a testing issue per se, but when it's buried in water, you have to account for those pressures. So
No,
we're trying to
I agree with all that.
provide
Yeah.
testing,
Yep.
additional testing measures that would allow for pipe that's submerged.
Okay.
Not all sewer pipe is submerged.
Right. I agree with that.
So
So-
this is for testing in,
So would it be pressure tested at a higher pressure when it's submerged in
I
water?
forget, would it be the same pressure test, similar to what we did at the end that we were able to accept? I don't think I can't remember if it's a pressure test, but there was a different method of testing so that it's actually feasible to perform that test because you can't get it to the pressure it needs to be with a traditional flux.
Right. Yeah, and I think some of the pipe ratings that are used too
So
wouldn't
it
handle
was
some of the
providing
pressure,
the-
like it would literally blow the pipe apart. Some of the pressures that they were suggesting, like the manufacturers are coming back going, you can't do that with that pipe.
And that's why we have different testing methods besides pressure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So I mean, some of the stuff may be great. I just think it would be helpful to have the community that's building the infrastructure, contractors, look over the red lines and involve the development community. I mean, I don't understand why you wouldn't involve the development community. I mean, some of these things have cost implications. One of my primary things, we have a number of projects that are approved, ready to go build. I presume, I don't know, maybe they're all in compliance with this. It's all pretty simple stuff. It's pretty normal subdivision stuff, and maybe it's not affected. But, are we going to be facing having to revise construction drawings or the existing ones that are approved?
So the two existing projects could potentially need revisions if the development improvement agreement isn't signed prior to this going into effect
Yeah,
first
so
of
that- I
January.
mean, guys, you want to understand why stuff costs so much, right? Why homes cost so much? Yeah, I mean, we spend a fortune on engineers. I'm sure you guys have spent a fortune doing this. I mean, it all adds up and it all gets passed through. So, I mean, hearing that isn't great when you have projects that are in the pipeline and you got to go, "Oh, sorry, guys, time out. Go back to the engineers. I hope they're still around that designed that plan and we got to revise the plan." I mean, there's just some practical things here. And then our contracts typically with the contractors that do the pipe work, reference in the contract, the town construction standards. That's what they're required to meet. They're of course following the designs, but they're also required to meet the construction standards. And some of these changes can have implications for, like obviously if there's stuff already going, it would be under this old standard.
Correct.
If there was something that was changed. And I don't know, Paul, I mean, maybe some of these things are all really good and they'll go, yeah, we applaud these.
None of them are going to be difficult. The
Okay.
only, I would say that the two DIAs that we're waiting for the two approved projects, if those were executed prior to this ordinance going into effect, none of these changes would be required within those two plans.
Okay, so they would basically fall into this
They would
standard.
fall under the existing current code.
But if the red
That's
lines,
the way the DIA is written, that it's set to the existing current code.
I mean-
Previously, the previous subdivision improvement agreement required compliance with any code updates at any time. So kind of restrictive and kind of difficult. If he was in the middle of laying 1,000 feet of pipe and the code went into effect in the middle of that and change some sort of restraints that could cause a headache. The new development improvement agreement doesn't require that.
I just think a red line would be helpful. I mean, I might not even be here if I had a red line and you guys might prefer me not to be here. So, a point is if you could put it online,
I'll discuss with the,
on the site. And
Site, if that's
I'm asking
something-
the board, this is a workshop. That, you know, if, I think you want to be transparent, you want people to know what you're doing, be transparent, Mayor. Right, so
Sure.
that's all. And I've been to code revision meetings for the county. Same issue. They're talking about little sections, piecemealing it, not redlined. And even the planning commission is going, you know, can we have a red line, please? Because it's a whole lot easier to understand looking at a red line document of what's being changed. And that's all I'm asking is you get that out in advance before you all approve ordinances. I mean, at least give the board and the community that builds stuff the ability to review the red line. That's all. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks. Okay, anybody online? No? Okay. Shortest workshop yet. I guess we'll take a break and rejoin the official board meeting at 6 p.m.
All right.
okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
They were, you're walking over here. I took them on about a 4-mile hike today up in the woods. And